I am Lisa Hudson, and I am one of the artists that was involved in the Metamorphosis Festival in Bangor. I'm I live in Bethesda, and my studio is in the old goods yard in Treborth. If I'm forced to describe it, I suppose I call myself multimedia, multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary, depending on how fancy I want to sound. I'll use a medium depending on what I'm trying to say or do or achieve. So I play with sculpture and materials, but also drawing and filmmaking and performance. But mainly I like to collaborate. I don't like working on my own. During the first lockdown, I was doing my master's, so I had planned for a lot of socially engaged art, which didn't happen. And so what happened with that was that my practice got much smaller, and I made books. I made small artist books, and I made videos, and I made things that I could do at home on my kitchen table. But what I did lose out on in that work was the socially engaged element. However, what sprung up was a lot of activity on Zoom and a lot of connections and projects and experiments that were happening, which were very open and easy to get involved with, like Utopias Bach. And Utopias Bach is an experiment that was devised or come up with in the first lockdown with a group of artists who already knew each other initially, who was talking about ways that art could be more functional, could be used to better to make the world a better place for humans and non-humans, and it's focusing on the small, so utopia being a huge concept and Bach being small, and asking the question, does working on a small scale with things that we can manage empower us to make changes and to make small changes that make the world a better place? I can't remember, because time is tricky after COVID or during COVID. I do know that they have run side by side, and that Metamorphosis events have actually helped to cement or form relationships with Utopias Bach, or within Utopias Bach, because some of the people that we worked with in the first Metamorphosis have become part of Utopias Bach, and so some of the Metamorphosis ideas have moved into Utopias Bach, and I think some of our Utopias Bach ideas may have pollinated the Metamorphosis as well. I haven't researched this, but it feels like they've fed each other, definitely. Vanda. Vanda was involved already because you'd asked her, and I was. It came after the first lockdown, didn't it? And I think we were all just really keen to do something together, to see if we could do something. We'd reached the point of really questioning, okay, what can we do? Because we can't just do nothing for all this time and just meet on Zoom. So it came at a really good time. The first Metamorphosis.
Yeah, so the safari.
The safari, yeah. In general, that feeling of potentially being contagious, of like everybody trying to get away from you, I think had a deeper effect than I first gave it credit for, certainly. And when I actually got COVID, that was that feeling of sort of the horror that I might have got close to people and given it to them was really strong. And I think but when it came to the Metamorphosis, I think or with the safari and Metamorphosis actually, in the performance that we did with Cronecast, I think knowing that people weren't going to get too close to you, weren't going to interrupt what you were doing with their physical presence, was actually quite freeing and was quite safe. It created a more definite boundary between performance space and audience space, that if you're doing physical performance and you're a bit shy or a bit nervous, was actually quite comforting to know that people were going to watch from a distance. Because I've seen other artists having to deal with people feeling the feeling they have the right to actually physically interact, touch, pull on, step on artists in performance. And in the back of my mind, my fear when I'm performing is that someone's going to want to do that, and how do you deal with it? So that was less, because we had a solid reason to say, back off, if anyone did, but nobody did. So the safari, the first one, that was really interesting, because I was, after having been so separate during the lockdown, I was just so excited to be amongst people that I wasn't thinking too much about the COVID situation, but I was sort of fearful about being in front of people and more nervous than I had been before, because I was so out of practice. But within the first sort of 10-15 minutes of wandering around the woods and feeling how people were stepping back, I managed to completely forget their existence, really, forget that I was performing, and just end up interacting with the fellow crones. And I think that was the most embodied I've ever been in an art performance, the most other space that I've allowed myself to go into with an audience. Definitely, that was really intense. But then when we were on the street in Bangor, I think because it was much more public, and people were not there to watch. The only people who'd come to Safari were the people to watch us, whereas the people in Bangor were just going about their dailiness. So it was almost an opposite thing, where rather than feeling fearful that anyone was going to get in my way, I was feeling a bit more worried that I would scare people off, because we were handing out cake and plants, and every time I went close to someone I felt worried that I was invading their personal space. And if you move that forward to the Dinas Dintley film, I mean, the weather made sure there was nobody else there anyway, so I was not remotely concerned about audience or other people. And I was completely unaware of the audience that were watching with binoculars. They were so far away, and there was so much else going on weather-wise closer to me that I think between the weather and the otherness of being in costume, my sphere of world was actually quite small. I was completely unaware of anyone apart from my fellow crones, and even then just the one in front and the one behind, not even everybody, because the weather was so... I was very much in my body then, because it was so cold and beaten and battered, and my skirt was bruising my leg, but it all felt like that was the appropriate way to be feeling in that situation, doing that performance. So, but I was completely unaware of audience then. It might, yes, I think maybe it was the pandemic framing, but also the time to be thinking about things as well, to be reflecting, and the fact that it was a research-based project or experiment showed that gave us permission to think harder about things, and having the time through COVID to think harder about things, and being involved in doing a master's at the same time, it really let me focus to really think about what I was doing. So other performances, I'd never had the time to get that deep in, and I'd certainly always been more involved in my head. There was something very freeing about Chromecast and about that first safari, the Surrealist Safari, in that it did feel like there was so much energy that needed to come out, and it was that, possibly from the pandemic, it was that pushed me to be able to perform in a different way. Like, I think the performance had always been just a way to carry a costume that I'd made, or to get across another prop that I'd made, where I still felt that the making was the art and the performance was some sort of delivery. Maybe Chromecast was the first time I felt like the performance itself was the art. Mainly in that it's evolved a lot. So the first Chromecast, the skirt, I think I'd finished my master's the day before, and I had one night to make the skirt, so it was the same frame but had very different things on it. And as it's progressed, more things have been added. The hat's got better, it fits better. But the best thing that I've noticed recently, because part of Chromecast is about communing with the non-human and recognising the non-human or more than human in ourselves. And this jacket was made in 2008, and it's been in this studio since all that time without any bother, hanging from the ceiling. But because I've made this skirt, so I've put it on the mannequin, and the studio mice have climbed up the skirt and they've eaten all the holly berries off the shoulders. This was completely covered all down the back here as well in holly berries, and a little party of mice, not when I was here, have shimmied their way up the skirt. For the first time they've been able to get access to it, and they've picked off every single 13-year-old holly nut and eaten it. So this is still, I mean, they might have moved in and then they'll be part of the performance. It's like it's
more than human artists.
Yes. So they've now participated.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it's local, so that kind of helps because we're in a rural area. I knew that I'd know a lot of the audiences on a personal level, so that makes it feel very safe. But I feel that the smallness and the local focus also meant that it wasn't results driven, and that it had that, you know, if someone's doing a big festival that's like nationwide, then they'll have a big amount of money that they'll have to justify spending, which means they'll need big outcomes and they'll need big names, and it kind of presents this sort of production working atmosphere where everyone has to justify the money they've had. Whereas being a research project and being local, it felt like Metamorphosis was genuinely about the process. It didn't just say it was about the process, it was genuinely about the process of making and of its impact on us as artists, rather than how have we changed the world with this one event, which is an expectation. It feels like every event has, that you have to prove that it's changed the world after doing it. And this one we could be much more inward and be about how we've changed our practice.
So the festival more as a starting point and not as the outcome.
Yeah. Or many starting points, or just points through the process, like, you know, checkpoints or something as you go through every year would be nice. Well, that's what's that's the most exciting thing, is how from Safari, then sort of more the relationships that started to build in Safari then became more frequent. You saw those people more often, you got involved with things with them more often, like yourself. And because of the Safari Metamorphosis and Utopias Bach seeming to sort of grow together at the same time, there's been that cross-pollination. So I can't remember the question now, I've gone off. But the actions of Sophia's Safari created relationships that have moved into Utopias Bach. Then Utopias Bach has reached one of its tendrils out to Metamorphosis, so Utopias Bach and Metamorphosis occurred in the same place at the same time as a partnership in this Metamorphosis Festival. And since then, as far as embodied art goes, and my particular process, the Ernest Veilog experience that seems to have grown out of it, and then the really playful experience in the White Cube with the passports is a continuation of that embodiedness that started in Safari, because the experience of Ernest Veilog and of sharing that, to then translate that back into the White Cube, where we all just had permission to be silly and to go with the first thought, the first idea, just try it and see, that sense of exploration and has come from the first safari, I think, and just grown and spread and integrated and woven into all of our practices. So Ynys Veilog, I feel, was part of Metamorphosis, even though it was not during the festival. It feels like it was an extension of. Ynys Veilog was a very brief takeover of a small island and a broken boat shed by Utopias Bach and the NWK collective, I believe, with a flag, with passports, with an intention to maraud. And the reality, the experience of it was a sort of a questioning about ownership and about place and space and freedoms, really, because we invaded this tiny island, we took it over for a very short time, and I hope we left it as we found it. And during that time, just for that brief anarchic temporary autonomous zone, we ignored no trespassing signs, we ignored private property signs, we climbed, we jumped, we shouted through loudspeakers, and we owned the place. And then we drifted away. So the white box really gave us a chance to reflect on the idea of place and space and ownership and emergency, and about sort of, I was thinking about longevity really, because the boat shed was disappearing, the white box was a very brief time, our occupation was a brief time, and the sort of the state of emergency is something that you hope doesn't last forever. So, and it also gave us, it was a space to kind of let go a bit as well, and any kind of energies, I don't know if there was energies left over from that, but it felt like there was something to let go of. And I so enjoyed when it came to towards the end and we all made our raft and stood on it for just a simple pleasure. Like the whole time when Hugh was carrying the flag at Ynys Veilog, I wanted the flag. And then it was up on a post and I couldn't reach it, so I couldn't have the flag. So I got the flag in the white box, and I got to be quite sort of quite the conqueror by standing there and just waving my flag and standing for something, even if I didn't know what it was.
Do you feel, because you said you are engaging with this idea or technique of metaphorical exploration, that both Ynys Veilog and what happened in the white box, kind of the setup of framing, was a kind of embodied metaphorical thinking? Definitely,
definitely. That's what and it's sort of really what I'm interested in with the art metaphor, is the way you can make a drawing or you can make a small sculpture or something, and you can take massive risks with it. It feels like a massive risk, but actually it's got no real world consequences. And so did Ynys Veilog. I mean, we were trespassing, but we were safe, really. You know, we weren't in any real danger, so it gave us, it sort of let you explore that without any, you know, just in a metaphorical way. So without real world consequences, explore the feelings and the actions and the associations of taking over a space, taking over land, being in charge, daydreaming about what you could make of it, what your responsibilities would be if you did, if it was yours. What does actually owning a space even mean? Can you ever really own a space? It was all those thoughts come from it. For me, the core metaphor was the flag, because it's a difficult one for me, because it's got like this huge attraction. Waving a flag is so much fun, but it has such a weight to it, the flag, the conquest, the ownership, the kind of planting a flag in the moon, for fuck's sake, things like that, the kind of the staking of a claim. And yeah, I think flags are problematic, but they're also triumphant if you know you're good. And that's the thing, as soon as you're carrying a flag and you feel like you're in the right cause, you want to wave that flag, and you want to, it's like a banner or anything, you're nailing your colours to the mast and you're choosing a side and all of that stuff. I don't know, I find it a really interesting paradox, because I do love them. But they're symbolically complex. I have a bit of a mental block because I don't think very much about my audience ever. I very rarely make work with the thought of exhibiting it, and I certainly don't expect to sell it. For me, it's definitely more a part of the process. So when I'm doing socially engaged art, I don't think of it as artist and audience. I think of it as a group process. We've had with different roles and power structures, whatever, but on the whole, I never think of them as my audience. I would think of them as my participants or my co-creators or my group in some way. And so for me, the benefit, I'm not making art for an audience. I'm not making art for that. I'm making it as an experience of living with other artists a lot of the time, and sometimes other people who are not artists who just get involved in that particular creative process. It's only really occurred to me when you asked me that I don't ever think of the audience. Like, that's why as soon as I've made something, I'm totally bored with it, because I can't imagine that there's any more purpose for it than me making it. At the moment, I am working on Utopias Bach, well, a few Utopias Bach experiments. As part of the core partnership of Utopias Bach, my particular interest is on reflective learning and of different sort of power structures in a learning environment. That's what I'm really, really interested in. So although I've got ideas for experiments that are socially engaged leading outwards, which feels like that's sort of quite a central role of Utopias Bach, my personal interest is in how the process is working and how different ways of documenting things, different ways of, particularly I'm really interested in creative research, and I only did a year's PGC, but the sort of research that goes into social sciences and the way you have to write in the social sciences, the way you have to reference everything, and you can't have your own idea. You can't just have an idea and leave it open to discussion until you've proved that idea and taken 15 years until the idea is obsolete to prove the idea. Then you can't even mention it, and it just feels like the most terrible way to do any kind of to gain knowledge. So I'm really interested in phenomenological research and the things that can't be quantified by numbers or by bums on seats or by how much more money the person is earning having done the thing or whatever, the thing where people just go, I feel different, I'm more engaged with my life, I've had I felt like I dreamt I was a cloud, anything. These things are just as important, in my opinion, in research into humanity as facts and figures and economical statistics. So I'm particularly interested in Metamorphosis and Utopias Bach for that reason, because we're looking for different ways to document, different ways to express, how to answer it, different ways to ask questions that isn't a survey where people have to just, where someone will take 5 minutes to think about something that actually is going to affect the rest of their life, but they just go, ooh, slightly agree, and carry on to the next question. So that's, again, I've forgotten your question now, but that's what I'm interested, that's my future, I'm hoping, is thinking more about that and researching that and maybe teaching that, and that's where what my art is really interested in, is those processes now. Only the power of reflection is really good, because I've said so many things today that I hadn't thought of explicitly and specifically in my head, but feelings that I've known were there but haven't examined. And it's just whenever you think you've thought of something and then you have a conversation, or you realise you haven't thought it, you don't know it yet, and there's so much more to think and say. Could go on forever.